When you think of great American automotive manufacturers, ones that have made a real impact through history, of course you can't ignore companies like Ford, GM, Chrysler, Buick, Cadillac, maybe even Studebaker. And all of those companies have done great things at certain times in history, but of all the American companies that have ever set out to build cars really for the future, nobody, and I mean nobody, was as ahead of their time as Dueseberg. Now you may hear the name Dueseberg and immediately assume that this is a German company. You know, Hindenburg, Heisenberg.
You're goddamn right.
Dueseberg. But actually, it's a thoroughly American company with a thoroughly American story. Okay, it is true, Fred and August Dueseberg were German-born Americans, thus the name Dueseberg. And in terms of the cars themselves, one could certainly describe the whole endeavor as being somewhat German. Things really got going for these brothers shortly after the turn of the century, as the young entrepreneurs became quite involved in the automotive industry in their own ways, even building race cars and race engines and making aircraft and boat engines for the war efforts. But in 1919, the two began working on their own engine and a car for the newly formed Dueseberg Motor Company. Their first car was the Model A, and it featured a few firsts for American cars. One, it was powered by a massive straight 8. That was the first production straight 8 in America. And second, it had hydraulic brakes all the way around. Crazy stuff for 1920. The car's actual release would be delayed and it wouldn't really be a massive sales hit for the new company, but that was okay. Fred and Augie were busy at this time, still building Dueseberg race cars. In 1924, their Dueseberg Specials would take the win at the Indianapolis 500 as America's first supercharged race car. These guys were crazy to say the least. Oh, and remember that supercharging part, that actually matters for the future. On the production side, things weren't exactly great for Dueseberg as the 20s carried on. That is until 1926, when Dueseberg would be partially bought by the Auburn Motor Company, led by legendary businessman E.L. Cord. He quickly put Fred back in charge, that is the engineering mind of the Dueseberg duo, with one goal: to build the greatest American car ever. In just 2 years, Dueseberg would do exactly that. At the end of the 1920s, your average American car was still, well, something like a Ford Model A, which was no doubt a big step up from the Model T, but about as far behind this new Model J Dueseberg as the letter A is behind J in the alphabet. There were other rather advanced sporting or touring cars coming out of America at this time. Think something like the Rolls-Royce Phantom, which had an almost 8-liter straight 6, and it made about 100 horsepower. Incredible, honestly, for this time when you think about it. Or was it? Yeah, let's start with the Model J's engine. In its most basic form, this 420 cubic inch, 6.8 liter overhead cam straight 8 made 265 horsepower at 4,200 RPM. Ridiculous. And the later SJ version would be supercharged and make some 320 horsepower. A standard Model J would cruise past 100 miles per hour and could just about hit 90 miles per hour in second gear thanks to its lightweight build. Though designed towards the latter half of the 20s, this engine would prove to be the most powerful production engine through the 1930s, with the closest competitors being Cadillac's V16 and Mercedes 540K straight 8. Those engines were still making well under 200 horsepower through the 1930s though, but this 1928 engine made 265 horsepower. The reason Dueseberg could get over 100 more horsepower out of an engine that wasn't really any bigger than its competitors is pretty simple. It was an engine straight out of the future, and for this time, it had aspects to it that were only reserved really for the racetrack. Dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder. These were specifications that few manufacturers could pull off at this time. This car single-handedly brought about the horsepower races going forward, forcing other manufacturers to make larger engines with up to 16 cylinders just to try to keep up, and still they could not match the Model J's supreme performance. The Dueseberg Model J was a superlative machine for many aspects in terms of production automobiles outside of just the engine. to stop the incredibly powerful and fast machine, it had the largest hydraulic disc brakes in the world, and there was also a massive handbrake handy in case you needed some extra assistance. The frame was incredibly strong to be able to handle this hulking machine's performance. Fred Duesenberg decided to use a thick steel A-type frame laid out pretty much like a giant race car from its time. It was strong, it was durable, but it handled amazingly. But weight savings happened where possible with light aluminum alloy used both for the engine and the frame. Over its short lifetime, the Model J would come in multiple body styles, and this was because when you bought a Duesenberg, you were really just buying the chassis and the engine, and then somebody else would make the body for it. You could get something like a convertible or a coupe or a limousine or, honestly, loads of other options. Many were customized to the owner's taste, and various companies could do the work to make a Duesenberg your own. The Model J's bodywork was highly regarded for its elegance, its craftsmanship, and the attention to detail, making each car really a bespoke masterpiece. These cars were often only attainable for the elite of the elite, and the various coach builders would give these cars whatever luxurious touch its owners wanted. Because of this, a Model J could run its owner a hefty price tag upwards of $20,000. The most expensive was sold in 1934 for $25,000, which would be over $500,000 in today's money. The unveiling of the Duesenberg Model J marked a real watershed moment in automotive history. This was a new standard for luxury and performance and just craftsmanship. The Model J was unveiled in December of 1928 at the New York Car Show. Here was a car coming out of nowhere and absolutely putting the other luxury automotive brands to shame. Rolls-Royce, Hispano-Suiza, no matter how expensive or how luxurious their cars were, they were nothing compared to this new vehicle. And so crowds gathered around to get a peek at this new expensive car. For the equivalent of $175,000 today, you could have yourself one of these cars, but again, only in chassis and engine form. You'd then have to go get the bodywork done for the car by one of the big coachwork companies. It was all pretty fantastic. And then the Depression hit. Basically, right after the production for the Model J got going, as you know, America saw the largest economic downturn it had ever seen. Despite the simple fact that hard times never impact the richest of the rich quite like the middle and lower classes, Duesenberg's sales did plummet in 1929. Elite potential Duesenberg buyers really became cautious. Sure, this might be the single best car in the world by far, and more importantly, the best way to flaunt your status. Difficult times call for difficult measures, and maybe spending $100,000 on a car would be a better decision than spending $300,000. It certainly didn't help matters that the genius behind this entire project, that is Fred Duesenberg, experienced an untimely death in the summer of 1932 after crashing his own Duesenberg and then developing severe pneumonia in the hospital. In the end, the economic situation would mean that less than 500 Model Js were ever produced from 28 through the 30s. The initial base Model J was a statement car in and of itself, but the SJ version was just another level of performance. Released just a few months before Fred's death, and certainly his crowning achievement, the supercharged version of the Model J engine put out a whopping 320 horsepower at 4,000 RPM. The torque and the pull at low RPM on these cars is just ridiculous, and this car could surpass 140 miles per hour. It was based on the original supercharged engines developed for racing by Duesenberg, and very few SJs were made and exist today, but this model stands really as a testament to Duesenberg's capabilities, and for me it confirms that if Fred Duesenberg had been doing his thing at a different time in history, really any time but the Depression, the Duesenberg company could have potentially continued on and exists today, and we would put its name right there along modern supercar and hypercar manufacturers. Duesenberg really knew their audience, and their advertisements through the years would show it. My favorite is this one from Vanity Fair, depicting a wealthy man sitting next to a fireplace in what appears to be like a 3-story room. And there's not even a car in the ad, just a rich dude enjoying his richness. Duesenberg would run a whole group of ads in this vein, showing wealthy hunters or even really well-off fancy women. The idea behind ads like this are refreshing in their simplicity. When Lincoln shows Matthew McConaughey driving a Lincoln around, the goal is to get people to think to themselves, well, Matthew McConaughey does this, I probably should too. But it's not exactly spelled out quite that way, whereas these ads just come out and say it. Rich people own Duesenbergs. If you're rich, you should own one too. It's pretty simple. Now, the main resource for my research on the Duesenberg company and the Model J is Dennis Adler's amazing book simply titled Duesenberg. I've linked it down below if you guys want to dive deeper into this story and into the history of Duesenberg. Jay Leno points out in the foreword to that book that what makes this car so outstanding is that you can't really categorize it. Was it a sports car? Was it a luxury vehicle, a tourer, a large sedan made for the whole family? It's difficult to say because it was indeed all of those things at the same time, and in many ways it ushered in a new era for automotive design. Capable but usable sports cars going forward, the entire segment of Grand Tourers, they really owe so much to what the Duesenberg brothers did with this car. When you set everything else aside, all the other things that make this car great, in terms of just raw power, nothing like the Duesenberg Straight 8 would exist, especially here in America, until really the 50s when the Hemi engine came out. And so if you were a person in the 30s or 40s and you had crazy money and you knew a lot about cars, you would get yourself a Duesenberg and you would get to experience a vehicle with the capabilities of something literally decades ahead of the competition. It was a car of the future. Duesenberg advertised the Model J as the world's finest motor car. But unlike that one coffee shop claiming to have the world's best coffee in the movie Elf, and most cars with their claims, let's be real, this car actually lived up to its claims. I'm guessing you've heard the phrase, "that's a doozy." Well, that phrase comes in part from the Duesenberg, and originally it just meant the best. The car was so above and beyond anything in its market that the name literally became synonymous with greatness. Duesenberg cars were born out of a truly unrestrained pursuit of automotive excellence, unlike almost any other automotive project in history. If you're familiar with motorcycle history, I think it's fair to say the Duesenberg cars were very much like Brough Superior, or perhaps even closer to Vincent motorcycles in their day. There's a good chance you've seen Jay Leno drive his Duesenbergs, and the sense you get from really anyone lucky enough to experience one of these automobiles on the road is that it's basically like a modern car. My question is, will there ever be another car like this? Can there ever be another vehicle so far ahead of its time in terms of power and performance and luxury? I would say probably not, and especially not for this price. A modern equivalent to this car would probably cost a few million. I think a company like Tesla would probably argue that they're incredibly powerful but still large and usable vehicles, and also, they're very futuristic, that they are like modern Duesenbergs. But for me, there's a few reasons why this comparison doesn't really work. A Tesla Model X is, on paper, pretty affordable for what it is, at least in terms of performance and technology and even safety, but the Model Js were true luxury vehicles, and Teslas just aren't. They cheap out in a lot of those areas, and they're just not cars that you think of when you think of craftsmanship. They don't exude that same kind of beauty and comfort. So for me, it's just not the same kind of car as a Duesenberg. In my opinion, there probably will never be another car like this. And if you look at just the vehicle themselves, not sales or commercial success, if you just look at the cars in their context, I think it's fair to say that the Duesenbergs are the greatest American cars of all time.